Now Thermaltake is actually stepping up the game with their latest power supply models as well as DDR5 memory. I was lucky enough to receive a sample from both of those component categories, and on this video I will be taking a very brief look at the Toughpower GF3 1650W fully modular power supply. I think this is one of the first ATX 3.0 compatible power supplies that has hit the market this far. So this does support the highly debated PCI Express Gen 5 16-pin power connector, or the so-called 12-volt high power connector, already out of the box. So you actually get two of those brand new connectors already out of the box on the power supply's end. So you could run like a high-end RTX 3090 Ti or RTX 4090 Hall of Fame, for example, from this power supply alone without having to use those famous Nvidia adapters, which caused many people issues. But that issue actually ended up being a user fault in the end anyways. I think that risk still exists even with these native cables, so you have to make sure when you install everything that you plug the connector all the way in. But it's very cool to see these ATX 3.0 power supplies finally hitting the market, so it's definitely much more convenient to use native 12-volt high power connectors from the power supply, so you can make the whole cable management a lot more tidier. Sometimes it actually varies. If you use the adapter, you have to use either 3 or 4 PCI Express 8-pin power connectors per 16-pin connector. So if you want to use the official Nvidia adapters, you have to use 6 8-pin PCI Express power connectors in total, or if you use, for example, the EVGA adapters, then you have to use 8, so that's a lot of PCI Express 8-pin power connectors in the end. Now, as I don't have any like professional test gear available, I can't really test the actual characteristics of this power supply unit, like test the efficiency level at different loads or even the ripple values. So I actually went online, and as Johnny Guru doesn't really review modern power supplies anymore, I actually went for the go-to website at the time of making this video, which is Cybernetics. They actually made a very extensive review of this power supply unit back in last October, I think, and the results were better than what I expected, especially on the European mains power standard. So the power supply, this power supply unit was actually able to do 80 plus platinum requirements, almost, I mean. So at 100% load, which means 1650W output power, the power supply managed to do well above 90% efficiency. The official requirement for 80 plus platinum certification is 90% efficiency at 100% load for the European standard and 89% efficiency on the American voltage standard. So it was clearly up there among with other 80 plus platinum rated units, and even at elevated output power, so they did a 110% load test, which equals like a bit over 1800 watts output power, and that means 2000 watts on your actual socket on your wall, and it was still able to do the 80 plus platinum requirement, so the result was a tiny bit above 90%. On the American standard, the results were visibly worse, so only like 87% at 100% load and 85% at 110% load. But honestly, you can't really test these large power supply units effectively on the American standard, because you can't usually even find larger power supply units than 1600 watts that are available like globally. Usually those largest units like the Superflower LeadX 8-pack 2000 watt platinum, they are meant for the 230 volt standard anyways. So if you want to use that kind of a unit to its full extent, you have to convert the voltage to 230 volts before using it. So I think it was actually a pretty good move by Thermaltake to aim the largest wattage unit at this kind of range, because you can still sell this particular unit like globally, and you don't really even need larger power supply unit than this. So it doesn't really make that much of a difference whether you use a 1600 watt unit or a 2000 watt unit anyways. You can't really hit this wattage limitation that easily. It would require, for example, the latest Threadripper CPU from AMD, so the 64 core model, and maybe like 2 3090 Ti's in SLI. And if you are going for, let's say, like 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme World Record, then you could be having some issues if you wanted to run that entire system from this power supply alone. If you are going for that kind of setup anyways, I would always recommend you to use at least like 2 individual power supply units. But anyway, so the results were pretty interesting on the cybernetics graphs. The only reason why the 1650 GF3 couldn't do the official 80 plus platinum requirements on the European standard was that it wasn't able to maintain 94% efficiency at 50% load. That's the range where power supplies are usually most efficient. The best efficiency was achieved at 20% to 60% load on this unit, and usually the efficiency was between 93% and 94% in high ambient room temperature environment. But you could almost call this power supply unit an 80 plus platinum rated anyways, if you live in Europe I mean. And Cybernetics actually gave this unit their platinum label anyways. And it managed to pass all of the ripple tests and so on. So based on those tests, we can already know that the power supply is very capable and it does have good components, and it's a very good choice on the market. Pricing wise, it's pretty good, so it's definitely up there with the other models. So it's actually cheaper than many of the alternatives, but it's not the very cheapest unit at that kind of wattage range. So the pricing starts somewhere around like 330 or 340 euros in Europe, and here in Finland where I'm located, the pricing starts usually at somewhere around like 400 plus euros. But for example, the EVGA Supernova 1600 watt P2 starts somewhere around like 430 euros here in Finland. So the pricing is definitely alright. So as we already know the characteristics of the power supply and how it performs, I thought about taking a look at the unit itself in a more close look, like very briefly. Let's like unbox the whole packaging. Let's look at the unit and see what kind of accessories does the power supply actually come with. So it's 80 plus gold, and that was actually the only minus part what I thought about the unit when I saw it for the first time. Nowadays, with the energy crisis and so on, especially here in Europe, efficiency has become a lot more important topic for the vast majority of users. So it would be very good from Thermaltake's perspective to release like an official 80 plus platinum rated unit or even a titanium rated unit at this wattage range, as long as it doesn't cost like overly much to create a titanium rated unit at 1650 wattage range. So the biggest features are definitely that it's ADX 3.0 compatible, so it has the brand new 12 volt high power connector, smart zero fan. I think that means that the power supply is like semi-passive. You can control it with the onboard switch that's all located on the rear I/O. So if you have it enabled, I would assume the fan will stay at 0 RPM up to like 50% load and so on. So it's pretty good if you want to make the whole system less noisy. You can actually do it with that switch over there. 100% Japanese capacitors and 10-year warranty. Pretty good if you ask me. It's actually a pretty good idea to invest in a very good power supply, because if you buy a very good one, you can actually keep it around for a very long period of time. I have been using my Superflower LEADX 8-pack 2000 watt unit since like 2015 or 2016, and I still think that it's one of the best power supply units in the world, even when it's lacking some of the newest features. So that's why I really hope that we see more of that kind of level stuff from different manufacturers. But that's why if you, for example, buy this kind of a unit, you can actually expect to use it for like 10 years or so, as long as there are no major updates that could make the old power supply units like incapable of running the new components. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. There's the smart zero fan at the rear I/O, and we have many of the other features advertised on the back side of the packaging. So features: ADX 3.0 compatible, 80 plus gold certified, up to 90% efficiency, high amperage single 12 volt rail design. So if you are into overclocking, especially extreme overclocking, it's always best to go for a single rail power supply unit. Multi-rail is only for safety purposes. So if you have, let's say, a very bad short circuit on your system, the power supply will trigger the overcurrent protection much faster compared to a single rail unit. But that could actually cause some issues when overclocking. So you might, for example, face or trigger the OCP too early on. Overcurrent protection is actually something that can be a little bit annoying on some power supply models. On some power supply models it's quite picky, so it will trigger quite quickly after the official wattage range or limit of the unit. You can actually see some very short peaks where the power consumption will actually go very high for a very short time period. When I was testing my 28 core Xeon, so the W3 175X, even on water cooling, so I was running like 3D Mark Times by Extreme CPU test and Cinebench, I had like a constant load of 1000 to 1100 watts, and I had like very short peaks of 1400 watts or so. So if you have a very picky OCP limit on your power supply, it could actually trigger from those very short peaks. And that's one of the reasons why we usually overshoot the power supplies for extreme overclocking. When the Bauer and Dankarp overclocked the EVGA 780 Ti Kimpin on LN2 a few years back, they actually had a constant load of 1200 watts on the card, but very short peaks up to like 2000 or 2400 watts. So that's one of the reasons why you really have to take this into account on different power supply models, and that's why you have to stack many power supplies in parallel when you do that kind of benching. Based on the tests by Cybernetics, as they ran the power supply at like 1800 watts and beyond, I would assume the OCP would be somewhere between 1800 watts and 2000 watts on this unit. So it should be pretty good if you ask me. Bundled with 16-pin PCI Express cables for the PCI Express Gen 5 graphics card, so that means 3090 Ti and RTX 4090. 100% Japanese capacitors, fully modular, low profile flat cables, and continuous and stable output power with an ambient temperature up to 50 degrees. And they actually mention all of the cables that you get inside the packaging, which is pretty good if you ask me. So we have 24-pin, 2 EPS 8-pin CPU power connectors. We have 16 SATA cables, or connectors should I say, and 9 PCI Express 6+2 power connectors, and we have 2 of the Gen 5 connectors and 8 Molex 4-pin connectors and even a 1 FDD connector, but that's why an adapter. But it's still good that they actually include that kind of a thing on these newest power supplies. In some very rare cases you might still require a very old like floppy device power connector. And we have the actual specs over here. So we have single 12-volt rail at 137.5 amps, which equals 1650 watts. So it's definitely more than enough if you ask me. And this is an EU based unit and fully compatible with Intel ATX 3.0 specs. And yeah, there's some advertisements about ripple noise and very tight voltage regulation and so on. So I think it should be still pretty good. So let's open up the packaging and let's see how the unit looks like in a very close look, and like size measurements compared to other power supply models you have seen on my channel. So we have some of the like instruction stuff over here, and all of the cables should be inside this bag over here. We can put it to the side. We don't really need it because we already checked what cables does the power supply actually come with. And here is the unit itself. And if you ask me, that's definitely a short unit when considering it's a 1650 watt unit. So it's pretty much the same size as the Seasonic Prime 1300 watt platinum unit that I have over here in the background. So if you compare that like side by side, it's pretty much the same length and overall measurements as the Seasonic Prime 1300 watt Platinum. So it's much shorter than the EVGA 1600 watt T2, for example. I also have that over here on the table, so we can put them side by side. So here's the EVGA Supernova 1600 watt T2 side by side with the Thermaltake Toughpower GF3 1650 watt unit. This is pretty much the same thing as the Superflower LeadX units, so it's definitely shorter, so this should fit a larger variety of different cases. But maybe the only minus part about this smaller size at this kind of power rating is that it might get a lot warmer compared to something like this. So it might be relatively noisy power supply unit, and you may want to keep the fan running like more than you would want to if you really push high currents through this kind of a unit. So I don't actually know how noisy is the fan on this power supply unit, but just wanted to say that I would assume this will run warmer than a unit like this based on the measurements, because this has less like surface area for cooling and so on. But otherwise that unit looks actually pretty basic. So we have the on-off switch at the rear I/O plus the Smart Zero fan and some label about that feature. So on, the fan does not operate if the PSU is at low loads, and off means silent fan operation. So it's like semi-passive if you ask me. So we have on and off switch over there. So I will just leave it at off for now. And we have all of the connector points at the other side of the power supply unit. We actually have the Gen 5 12 volt high power connectors over here. The peripheral and SATA connectors are on the top row over here, and 24-pin ATX is over here, and they don't actually have separated connector points for the CPU and for the PCI Express. So you can actually use any of these 7 connectors or 8 connectors over here for either the CPU, EPS, 8-pin power connectors, or for the PCI Express power connectors. So that's actually a little bit different compared to some other power supply models. And one thing about the cables, I don't really want to go like through them very thoroughly, because we already checked what cables or connectors does the power supply actually come with on the back side of the packaging. But just one very quick note, there's no braiding at all on these power supply cables. So they are just very basic, like black power supply cables, so I would assume they are at least very easy to bend. But if you want like braided power supply cables or even individually braided cables, then you have to search for options from sites like Cable Marts. But at least for now, I would assume they don't have any other like color options for their power supply cables like directly from Thermaltake. But yeah, so that's the Thermaltake Toughpower GF3 1650W power supply unit. G stands for gold. So I hope we will see a Toughpower PF3 or even a TF3 later in the very near future. But before that, this will be the very best power supply unit from Thermaltake at the time of making this video. So huge thanks to Thermaltake for providing me with this power supply unit. I will definitely use it on my current LN2 session with EVGA Z790 Dark Kingpin and 1300 KS CPU, and with some other components as well. So let me know what you think. Would you buy one of these new power supply units from Thermaltake, and will you be including one of these new ATX 3.0 power supplies if you are going for a brand new 3090 Ti or RTX 4090? So let me know what you think. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And thanks for watching one of my videos once again, and I will see you on the next one.